Good morning, everyone! On this blessed and beautiful morning, I decided to use walnut and maple I had lying around to make two cutting boards. I originally intended to make one giant board I had an order for, but I had enough wood left over to make another board. So, as a start, you see me cutting up my giant slabs of walnut and maple into smaller pieces. I ensure to cut out any chunk that might have a crack and only keep the best parts. Cracked pieces will be firewood or used for smaller or epoxy projects if needed. After obtaining smaller crack-free slabs, the next step involves cutting them into relatively equal width pieces. At this point, they may be only partially straight, but I make sure not to keep overly warped ones and straighten them. Additionally, one thing to remember during this step is to ensure that the grain goes with the cut rather than against it. In this step, I let my kids straighten each piece. By using my planer and my sled, I let my kids have a go at making perfectly straight, equal width pieces. The whole process is simple enough to let the kids handle it, and by planing a bunch of pieces at once, it is tough to mess up and end up with odd-sized cuts. The only tricky part here was me blurring my kids' faces. It took me 3 days of editing, especially my daughter's face, because she moves around like a greased lightning. Following that, all that's left is to glue all the pieces in alternating patterns. Once the kids had finished gluing up all the long pieces together, I looked at the scrap that was left over, and to my surprise, enough wood was left over for another board, so I just asked kids to glue that one up too. As you see, I used parchment paper to prevent glue from sticking to the clumps. However, despite my best efforts, the glue covered the clumps. Once glue dried for 2 days, the next step was to cut off uneven ends. During this step, I also got stumped. My planer was unable to accept any piece wider than 13 inches. However, the glue up for the primary cutting board was 19 inches wide. I decided to cut it into 2 parts for planing. I had to remember to mention it to my son to keep them both in the same dimension when he started planing it, and being the super reliable kid that he is, he did end up planing them both simultaneously to make sure they ended up being the same height. Once he finished planing and everything was straight and smooth, I had to cut them into 2.5-inch strips for the giant board and 2-inch strips for the smaller one. For the final glue up, I took the reins simply because there was a specific pattern that I had to adhere to for the order, and as great as my son is, he is still 6. And I was a bit concerned about whether the pattern would be as precise as I needed to make it. Thinking back on this, I will let him do it next time and learn about precision gluing. Notice that I ensure the grain is facing upward during the glue up. Once the glue dried for 2 days, my son took the boards and planed the larger one down to 2.25 inch thickness. As for the smaller one, I had no dimension in mind, so I asked him to plane it until both sides were smooth and straight. We significantly sped up the video and cut out some parts. Remember to make no more than 1/4 turn on the planer crank while planing an end grain piece of wood. Please do so to avoid wood blowing up and shattering violently. As the last cleanup step, I cut off each piece's splintered ends. Splintering at the ends will always happen when planing end grain pieces and is unavoidable. The customer requested I add grooves at the ends to make it easier to carry the cutting board as it weighed 18 pounds. So, a simple rounded bit did the job. Notice the clamped stoppers added at the ends. I do it to ensure that the groove is perfectly centered. I also added a few juice grooves to the meat cutting side of the board. The board was much larger than my jig, so I asked my son to help hold the piece. I could have used clamps instead of asking my son, but sawdust is just man glitter, and a man shouldn't shy away from being covered in sawdust from head to toe. I added nice corners to both pieces for the last step of finishing up the board's shape. For the main cutting board, I used a simple round over bit lowered just a bit lower than usual to give a nice lip to the top. For the smaller piece, I used the same round over bit for the top, and for the bottom, I used the Roman OG bit to give the user a nice groove to hold the board while carrying it. Now that both boards were ready, it was time to ensure they felt and looked amazing. I started sanding from 80 grit to remove any imperfections from routing and cutting, slowly moving up to 800 grit. From grit 180 and upwards, I would first dry sand the piece and then apply water and wet sand. When working with end grain pieces, it is essential to wet sand after dry sanding with the same grit, because once the wood gets a little bit wet, the grain stands up, thus making it feel rougher than it should be. It is the same as applying shaving cream if you have ever shaved. The cream holds up your hair, thus giving you a smoother shave. It is the same concept for the wood. Instead of shaving cream, you apply water. Once the board was all semi-gloss and slippery, I applied some oil. I do enjoy this step a lot. The whole board pops to life. I would apply a total of 3 layers of oil per side. The way to do so is to apply oil, let it drink for about 8 hours, wipe excess off with a towel until fully dry, and apply oil to the next side. Then repeat the whole process 2 more times. You do not need to use the same amount of oil for the second and third coats as the first, but you get the idea. After 3 coats, I noticed the wood wouldn't drink any more oil in. And as the last finishing touch, I applied beeswax to make the board shine. The process is straightforward. Scoop out some wax and smear it with your finger over the board. Move slowly on the highest rotation setting on your sander with a felt pad so that the friction causes the wax to melt and bond with the wood. With that, I completed both boards. Today's piece was the most giant board I have made to date. Handling such a large piece was challenging since my tools could not take it. However, I thoroughly enjoyed making the piece and working around my limitations. If you enjoyed what you saw, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. If you have any questions too, those are very welcome. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the following video. Bye bye!